Welcome back to Life Without Secrets. Today, we're diving into a topic that so many of us can relate to: navigating life's toughest transitions. Whether you're facing a career shift, an empty nest, or a season of uncertainty, my guest today has some incredible insights and tools to help you turn those in between moments into breakthroughs. I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Rebecca Sutherns as an author and midlife transition coach who specializes in helping high achieving women navigate the messy middle of life with clarity, energy, and confidence. Drawing from her own personal transformation, one that started with a bold sabbatical, Rebecca developed the Elastic Method, a structured yet flexible framework that helps women stretch into their next chapter without snapping or snapping back. If you've ever felt overwhelmed, stuck, or unsure how to move forward, this episode is for you. You'll learn how to align your values with your actions and reimagine a brighter future. So let's get into it. Dr. Rebecca Sutherns, welcome to Life Without Secrets.
Thanks so much, Julian. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
I am too. I was just telling you that this couldn't have come at a better time because I am getting ready to make a transition in my career. And so I'm going, for those of you that don't know yet, because I really haven't told any of you guys listening what this transition is yet. So everybody knows, if you've been listening long enough, I work in the ER as a nurse, as well as doing the podcast and so many other things, but I am stepping into flight nursing. So I'll be on the helicopter, which is super exciting, but it comes with a different schedule and a whole transition process for the whole family. So I am just so excited to learn from you today on this show and also learn about your journey. So I want us to kind of get to know you a little bit first. I always like people to like, who are we talking with today? So, Rebecca, if you don't mind just sharing a little bit about your journey. I know it's taken some twists and turns, everybody in life. So, what kind of sparked transformation in your life, and what inspired you to do the work that you do now?
Sure. It's funny telling a story looking back on it, right? It
All
can
right.
sound a lot more put together than it feels when you're living it forwards. But where I am right now is that I'm in year 27 of my own business doing strategy consulting, mostly in the nonprofit space. I'm Canadian and work with large nonprofits and helping them gain some clarity and set their priorities and that kind of thing. And so, out of that work over the last number of years, a couple things have happened in terms of me really stepping into that entrepreneurial role. Even though I've been doing it for a long time, my mindsets around it have shifted. But also, some of the actual work has shifted because increasingly, instead of just working with groups and teams and boards, I was getting calls from the chairs of those boards or the CEOs or executive directors of those leadership teams saying, "Hey, I could really use a conversation about my own kind of personal strategic plan," if we can put it that way.
Hmm.
And so that led to the growth of the coaching piece of what I do. So a lot of what I'm up to is group work in organizations and in sectors and systems, but increasingly also working with individuals one on one and in group settings. And in the context of that, have become really convinced that there's an important piece of imagination and creativity and curiosity that really help us navigate the transitions that we have. So you've described a really recent and ongoing professional transition. It could be that. It could be a more personal or psychological one that has to do with our identities and how we perceive ourselves, or it
Hmm.
could be other kinds of transitions in relationships that if we are changing our situation with an intimate partner, or we've experienced a loss in our family, a change of city. It's interesting because each of those kinds of transitions brings with it its own set of challenges, but there's also a lot of commonalities. And it's never really a linear, tidy process, but there's patterns. And I really have a pretty high comfort level for some of that kind of messy middle stuff that I love helping people through. And for me, some of that has also had to do with some personal transitions. My husband and I have 4 grown kids who are all in their 20s and are grandparents to 2 kids who are 5 and 2 who live right around the
So
corner
fun.
from us.
That's
And
awesome.
there's a lot of transition that goes with that. So even when the news is good, even when the transitions are ones that you have wanted and maybe
Hmm.
even gone after in the case of some job ones, there's still some work that needs to happen, right? In adjusting and adapting to it. And so a lot of my work is actually helping people find their preferred pathway to being adaptable, either as leaders or in their own personal life.
Love that. And that is, I mean, adaptability is so key to so many things. And as someone who likes things that are like structured and put together and everybody has their place and they know where they're going, those transitions can be feel a little overwhelming or like a struggle, even if, like you're saying, it's exciting, right? And some people, I think, even maybe don't even step into that thing that they really want to do because they're afraid of that transitional piece, so that they worry about what that's going to look like.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
how do you help someone go from, okay, good or bad, like you're saying, we all have to go through transitions. What is something that you help people? Is there a way to prepare for that? I know you said imagination and playfulness are also something to play with. Do you have some tools you can give us?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think one first step is almost normalizing your feelings and putting some language around it to go, even when this is a voluntary change,
Mhm.
it's still going to be tricky. And helping people kind of name that and say there's some grief usually attached with ending something, even
Mhm.
when that ending was it was time or it was chosen or whatever. And then that in between stage, whether that in between stage is quick or long, our brains just don't love uncertainty. And I think reassuring people that the kind of untethered uh, feeling of that in between is a really normal set of feelings and a normal place to be. And you mentioned excitement. I think as we embark on kind of the new beginnings that change brings, I think helping people understand that our bodies can feel very much the same when we are scared as
Mhm.
we do when we're excited, right? Think of a
Yeah,
roller coaster, right? It's that both
totally.
and kind of mix. And so I think there's a lot of work around mindset and vocabulary that can just really help to say if we frame this as excitement, how does that feel different than if we frame it as terror? Or if we're dreading a change, are we ready yet? Is there anywhere that we could look forward to pieces of it? Because I think sometimes we look at the whole thing as if it's sort of one big chunk, one big blank slate. And I think just having somebody that can help you think and talk through how to break it down and go, you know what, not everything is changing. Some things are staying the same. Where do we have some level of continuity? Where do we have some level of excitement about this? And what are we most scared of? And how can we prepare for that? I think that really helps on the emotional side. I think the other
Mhm.
thing too is sometimes people are in the midst of a transitional season, but they don't know yet what they're transitioning to.
Mhm.
Maybe they've
Mhm.
lost their job and haven't found a new one, or maybe they've experienced a death in their family and they weren't
Mm.
expecting to have to figure out what this next chapter looks like. And I think having a sense of hopefulness and someone to keep you company through that as you begin to, it's almost a can take on the form of career coaching, for example, or beginning to move into some acceptance of that. And so you're right that there's lots of tools that help, and I think one possibility is, tapping into our curiosity, sort of our sense of exploration around that when we can. That's a really hard thing to do if we're still in the depths of shock or grief or
Mhm.
some other emotions, but when we're ready for it, I think coming to a place of even if it's tentative curiosity can really help us, begin to see the possibilities in that next chapter that we really maybe didn't see before. So there's lots of sort of specific ways, but I think the main ones for me are giving some normalizing it, giving some language to it, and really just keeping somebody company as they get used to it and figure it out.
Yeah. This is probably like the perfect time, I think, to talk about this too. We're talking about two different things, whether it's a good transition or maybe a really hard one. And when you said that, I thought about all the fires in LA right now and the people who have lost their homes. And you mentioned like normalizing shock or grief. And I was like, yeah, I mean, I'm not even there and I feel shock and grief for them. And let's say someone is going through a transition where it's not something that is necessarily something to be excited about. Is there something that can help move from that grief or shock to that curiosity? Well, what could I do? What could this look like down the road?
Mhm. Yeah.
Is there
Yeah, because there's a lot of resistance in us, right? I mean, if we're
Yeah.
facing something that we didn't choose, there's a whole soup of emotions around that in terms
Mhm.
of the grieving piece. But one piece of that is I remember we went through a pregnancy loss quite late. We
Mhm.
our kids are older now, but and I remember all kinds of people reaching out for support. And I went through a phase where I was like, I don't want to be part of this club. It's just not, I didn't ask to be hearing everybody's
Mhm.
scary miscarriage stories. Like I just don't, and I was just really resistant even to the supports people could offer. And so it gave me a really clear sense of timing in terms of we're not always going to be ready for certain kinds of supports at certain times. And yet, if we don't find ways to move through some of that and
Mhm.
let those emotions kind of run their course, but with a sense of movement, we can get quite stuck. And so there are sort of healthier and more productive ways to grieve than others. And you don't want to put a timeline on it that makes people feel pressure that, geez, I really should be
Yeah.
feeling better by now. It's not that, but it's a sense of kind of not just staying in one place with it. And so they say that time heals, and I think there is something about timing. I don't think it's automatic that time heals. I think there's some other work that needs to be done,
Mhm.
but there is a sense of kind of appropriate timing. And an example for me that has happened more recently is the phase for us of our kids leaving home. We've got, as I mentioned, we've got 4, and I think one of the things that struck me about that transition of what's known as empty nesting
Mhm.
is that in our family, it was like this long period of emptying nest, right? It was almost 10 years between when our oldest and our youngest left. And I remember saying to my husband early on in that transition, I think I'll be okay when they're all gone, but I want them either all here or all gone. And I'm really struggling with the in between. And that continued to be true for me, and yet here I am kind of on the other side of that, and I'm much better able to see the mix of emotions that go with that, the really good opportunities and the things I love about this new phase that we're in, and missing the things still that I enjoyed about that earlier phase, but not feeling that same kind of sting of the kind of immediate grief that accompanied that at the time. And so there is an element for me of, wow, actually, you know what? It has gotten better. And yet it's gotten better over 10 years. And I think that's the other sort of contribution that I think this kind of coaching can help with is kind of to set people's expectations around the pace of this, because I tend to work with primarily women and primarily women who are used to having kind of a lot of success and control in their lives. And some of these
Mhm.
transitions aren't like that. And there's a guy named Bruce Feiler who wrote a book called Life is in the Transitions. And his
Mm.
research suggests that when we go through something he calls a life quake, like a major disruption or series of disruptions, we go through them more often than we think, probably about every maybe 18 months in our adult
Mm.
life, and they last an average of 3 to 5 years. So, when I first heard that, it actually kind of reset my expectations because I think sometimes our inside voice says, "Why aren't you feeling better by now? Jesus is
Mhm.
taking a long time." And I think it's because a lot of us are used to operating at a pretty fast pace. We're used to learning things pretty quickly, mastering them pretty fast, and moving on to the next thing. And especially for moms that run a pretty busy household, right? It's okay, move on. And
Mhm.
yet there's some things that actually just take the time to work it through. And I found it really helpful. I could kind of extend more grace to myself and other people when I heard that the average is pretty close to 5 years for some of these really major transitions. And often the complexity is that they never happen one at a time, right? I mean, you're never just going through one and it has this neat bow at the end and then you start the next one. They're kind of overlaid on each other. And yeah, so I think it's a helpful thing to be able to come at them with some measure of an explorer mindset
Mhm.
and a sense of perspective that says, okay, what is actually really deeply important to me here? And that can happen, I would imagine, for people that are losing their homes. You start realizing what's really important. But it can
Mhm.
also happen when you're doing a job change where you go, what's actually critical here to make my life and family work? And what am I willing to let go in order to try this new thing? And I think there's a clarity and a focus that can eventually come. It's just that it's usually preceded by a whole lot of fogginess, right? A whole lot of
Mhm.
murky, I don't like, you just feel like you're in muck, right? And so I think helping people realize that's not going to last forever, and being someone who's nearby to be able to kind of pull them out of that muck can be a really gratifying role to play.
Yeah. What would you say? I'm like, as you're talking, I'm thinking about every 5 years, it seems like I do something new. And if it's not, might not be in my career, but it's like something big. It's, okay, well, I've been in this job for a while. Okay, I'm gonna start a podcast.
Yeah.
It's almost like when the adventure kind of wears down, I feel like I'm like, okay, I'm ready. I need something new. Have you heard of that? And is that I almost like purposely put it on myself and I'll talk about it before I even get it, like I already have it. Just to put myself in that position. Like, even with the podcast, I was talking about it 6 months before I started it. Like, I'm just like, "Yep, this is what I'm doing," and I just talk about it like I already did it.
Oh, there's so much there. I am with you. I am someone who I like change. I like variety. I seek
Yeah.
out adventure and learning, and that's fun for me. And I know that for some people, that isn't the least bit fun. So it's not everybody's thing, but I'm like that too, where my business has been in existence for 27 years, but in my head, it's really happened in 4 and 5 year chapters
Mhm.
where, I've tried some new experiments, or my mindset around it has shifted, and I've kind of injected some things. So one example would be in 2017, our family went on a sabbatical for a semester. Um, and that was kind of a big deal at the time. We had kids, one was in a gap year, one was in university, two were in high school. Actually, one was in high school and one was in middle school.
Mhm.
So trying to extricate myself and my husband are both entrepreneurs, so getting kind of out of our work situations and getting the kids out of theirs and figuring out sports and friends and school and work and all the things, and taking off for 3 months was a pretty big adventure, but it really marked a real turning point for us. And I think that the what you were saying about kind of speaking about something ahead of time as if it's already happened, I feel like that in itself is a really interesting, helpful tool if a transition that someone's going through involves trying to create something new or step into a new identity. I almost picture it being like trying on a costume, right? And you try it
Mhm.
on at first and
Totally.
it doesn't feel like it quite fits you, but
Yeah.
then it isn't quite a fake it till you make it thing, but it's a bit like that where you go, "You know
Mhm.
what? I gotta get used to this." And
Yep.
sometimes we call it imposter syndrome, and I think we're hard on ourselves on that because we're not faking it necessarily like an imposter. We might just be growing into it or giving it a try. And so I still find that my work and my life is kind of a series of experiments. And certainly as we have gone through this emptying nest phase, my husband and I have said we don't feel like we need to make big decisions quickly on this of what we want our next thing to look like. Let's try some stuff. So, for example, last year in 2024, we had 3 different chunks of time where we went and worked remotely in a new location. And at first, when we did it, it was like trying to test it out, going, could we see ourselves moving here? And then we went, we don't have to decide that. We can just enjoy being here for a month, and if next winter we choose to go somewhere else or we don't, that's fine. It's not it doesn't I think finding it's not just being experimental, but it's lowering the stakes a bit. That's another tool
Mhm.
for people, is to find ways of trying out things that don't have, like, dire consequences if you don't love it. Small doses, small steps, experiments you can hold loosely where the stakes are relatively low is a way to kind of build our courage, try some things, and not just kind of like counterbalance our tendency to overthink. Because if something is kind of a no big deal moment, hopefully we can sit a little lightly with it.
Yeah. Well, so then okay, so then we do those kinds of things and or maybe it just hits us suddenly, right? And then we're in that in between phase where it doesn't feel comfortable, but it is new. I would say it's similar, right? When we're talking about transitions, but I think it's similar to that messy middle of life that you talk about in like when we're in that midlife type of stage of life, which I don't know about you, but I'm like, what age is that? Because I'm like, I feel like I have a little bit of a midlife thing going on and I'm not that old. So I'm not like 50. So I'm like, well, I think it's just, I don't know, phases of life, but you tell me what you think. But I want to know you have your elastic method and maybe we can kind of go through that on what working out that messy middle.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, It's interesting. I've done some work with something called the Modern Elder Academy that Chip Conley has in Baja and Santa Fe, and they talk about middle age being they call it a midlife wisdom school at Modern Elder Academy, and but that the age range of so-called midlife is pretty broad, right? And I think partly this is for those of us that live in fairly privileged situations. It's partly a math question that sets our expectations because if I think of my life as being roughly 100 years long,
Mhm.
I have a very different pace and different kind of pressure than uh, if we think of our life as being like 65 years long, for example,
Mm.
where the middle is different, how long the middle is different, and it kind of resets our expectations because it's not an unreasonable thing to expect to live to 100, and certainly our children are very likely to live to 100 if they're in a
Well,
well-resourced
in
situation.
me, I feel like I'm gonna live till 120 because my grandma will be 107 this year.
That's again, I love that, right? And so if we can have
I'm
that kind of
living forever.
yeah, we don't have to rush through things. And that in between stage, a friend of mine introduced me to the expression "the hell of the hallway," and I think about the
Mhm.
hallway of a hotel or something like that, where you're walking down this hallway and it's just doors, right? And all the doors are closed, and they all kind of look the same, but you suspect that what's behind them is different. And it's a really unsettling sort of feeling. And if you could just kind of with conviction, walk through one of those doors and go, you're fine. But if you're like, I'm trying this one and I'm trying this one, and does my key fit here? Doesn't it? It just doesn't feel awesome, right? And
Mm.
so there is a bit of that, and certainly the elastic piece. It's slightly different but relevant because it's a metaphor first. Where if you think about a rubber band, an actual elastic,
Mhm.
uh, by definitions, elastics stretch and then they return to their original shape, right? But an elastic band, if you don't stretch it, if you just leave it sitting on your desk for months and you go then to stretch it, it often gets so brittle that it'll just break in your hand, right? So
Mm.
elastics need to stretch. Stretching is what they are for. And if it's true that a human can kind of relate to this metaphor, we need to stretch. Learning is good for us. Being a little bit outside of our really comfortable space is good for us. So I'm a fan of stretch. What I'm not a fan of is sort of overstretching or understretching. And the overstretching can come in two ways. One is if you have been too stretched for too long, it's
Mm.
very hard for you to find a shape that feels comfortable after that. So think about like an
Yeah.
old stretchy bathing suit or stretchy pants or something, right? Where they just kind of lose their elasticity at the waistband
Mhm.
because they've been stretched for too long. But another way of being overstretched is when it happens too much, too hard, too fast, and it just snaps, right? And that can
Mhm.
happen in one direction when some big trauma happens. But it can also happen when the cumulative pressures of we've added this stretch and this stretch and this stretch, and finally that elastic band just loses its capacity and it breaks. And that's what our lives are like, often as moms, but not only, where it's the cumulative pressures that just become a lot.
Yeah.
And it's not limited just to our work or just to our home life and that kind of thing. But unlike an elastic, the good news is that humans can learn to be more stretchy. We can build our capacity to be adaptable, unlike an actual elastic, because certain elastics, if you think in real life, like the little kind that go with braces, like orthodontic elastics, they don't
Yeah.
have a lot of stretch. But the kind that like a resistance band at the gym, for example, much bigger, has a lot more give to it. But what it is, what it is. Whereas in human life, we can learn to increase our capacity. And then what happens is you start going, okay, now if I'm going to stretch back to the where I was before, if we have grown and if our capacity and our exposure and our curiosity have all taken off in the meantime, we might not want to go back to old ways that used to fit us, old shapes that were fine before, but now they just don't feel right. And that has all kinds of
Mhm.
ripple effects in ourselves and for other people, right? Because we aren't doing this alone. And often those that are close to us go, well, and it could be our boss, it could be our partner, our kids are like, what do you mean you don't want to do such and such? You used to do that all the time, or you used to be fine with
Mhm.
that. And we
Yep.
need to find our voice in saying, you're right. I did and I was, and now I'm not. And
Mhm.
for me, that was really noticeable at certain stages of my parenting life because there were times when my children were younger where I was willing basically to drop anything for them and for my
Mhm.
parenting rules to willingly and happily take precedence over almost anything else I did. And
Mhm.
then I got to a place, and as they got older too, where I went, No, I'm not actually willing to say that anything they need at any moment is going to take precedence over any possible thing I could possibly need at any moment. And I had to kind of renegotiate. And it
Mm.
happened coming out of the pandemic for a lot of people too, in their work situations where they were being expected to go back into an office or wherever it might be. And were saying to their employers, I'm not going to do that anymore. And their employers were saying some variation of, but this is how we work here. And they were saying, no, that's how we used to work here. And what does the new work arrangement look like? And what have we learned? And so I think the idea of optimally stretching without overdoing it, but also without being willing to go back to old patterns that no longer serve us is really important. And that skill of unlearning and also communicating our needs in that situation are really important. And so, one other element of the metaphor for me is that in order to stretch, an elastic needs to be anchored somewhere. If you think about if you
Mm.
anchor it in one place, like around your finger, and you pull it, then it's stretchy. But if my finger isn't anchoring it, you're just moving it around, right? It's not
Mhm.
stretching. And so I think really understanding what our anchor points are, what are maybe there are values, maybe they're our mission, maybe they are something else enduring, like that
I
says,
love that.
I can be adaptable, but not in all directions at the same time. There's some things that I need to be anchored to that are going to allow me then to be really flexible and responsive in other parts of my life. And so helping people figure that out is partly what the book was about. There's other pieces around leadership skills and case studies and that kind of thing, but I think the core image of it is that metaphor of how are we and aren't we like these elastics, and how can we increase our stretchiness without selling out in a sense and finding ourselves in situations that no longer suit the person we're becoming. And so for me, one of the key questions with my coaching clients is, who are you now? And what does that new version of yourself actually require?
Yeah, and what are those anchors for you? That is huge. I have never heard that before. I love, love, love that analogy and how you've explained that. That makes so much sense. So much sense, and I think it's super helpful to think about that in that way. And, being willing to stretch, but taking into consideration all of the things. You don't wanna snap. So that is huge. One thing that I am very curious about in my own life, and I know other people listening might be as well if they have family, especially if they have kids. When we go through transitions, oftentimes they're not just impacting us, they are impacting the whole family. And you kind of mentioned kind of being able to explain to the family members, well, that was me, and now I'm becoming this. So that's one way to do it is talk through that. But is there other ways to like navigate transitions with the entire family? Do you have any advice?
I feel like part of it is your almost like the altitude that you work at. So I think there are people who tend to think about themselves in a transition, and it becomes the unit of analysis is quite individual. And I know for me that my unit of analysis tends to be fairly collective almost all the time. And so when I make decisions, it is baked into me to make them with the whole kind of family ecosystem in
Yeah,
mind.
that's how I feel
Um,
too.
I really do, but I feel like in some ways that has served me well and served all of us well. On the other hand, I think I've probably held on to that longer than necessary. So, for example, I needed lots of flexibility in my work when my kids were little because I was the person that was going to get that phone call from the school when somebody fell off the playground or forgot their lunch or needs to go
Mhm.
to the dentist, right? And
Yep.
I was very willing to be that person at that time. Um, and yet, over time, I really held on to that need to be flexible. And so, probably closed myself off from some professional opportunities because of needing or thinking I needed to be here for the kids, and
Mhm.
yet they probably were gonna be fine. It was probably me not adjusting to the new stage that they were at quickly enough, and so part of it is how what our unit of analysis or altitude on the situation is, and my husband and I have always made decisions kind of with the whole picture in mind, but
Mhm.
I've got this interesting mix of sort of weird kind of jealousy and admiration for people who are able to just say, "Yeah, they're gonna have to figure that out because 'cause I'm going and doing this right now." And so I think finding the balance that we each want between taking everyone else's needs into consideration and what we need becomes really important. I have a friend, I use her example a lot. It seems that she's from New Zealand. Her name's Lisa O'Neill, and she wrote a book a number of years ago called Everything You Want. And I remember it was about maybe 5 years ago that I first saw that book and went, huh, I haven't asked myself what I want in a really long time, because
Mhm.
what I wanted and am thankful for was to have kids and to have a good sized family. But I felt like what I want personally was kind of almost, I'm overstating it, but it's like it was a one time question 30 years
Mm.
ago
Mm.
that then I lived the consequences of that mostly happily all the way through. But I hadn't actually paused, now that my kids were getting bigger, to go, what do I want? And also, would I even give myself permission to ask that question?
Mm.
Because it had become, even though I was very involved in other things, and I think I had this stereotype that women who kind of lose themselves in their family responsibilities, it's because they made that their job, right? I've
Yeah.
always worked outside my family. I've always had lots of other things going on. But because that was such a core identity for me, I hadn't actually seriously reconnected with what I wanted now that I was ballpark 50 at that time. And but I realized the reason I didn't know the answer wasn't just because I hadn't asked myself, but it was because I don't even know that I was willing. It felt almost like a selfish question, and it
Yeah.
doesn't anymore. It's funny, I can see that as one of the evolutions in me over the last number of years that really did parallel this emptying nest stage of saying, what questions and what curiosities do we give ourselves permission, in a sense, to indulge in?
Mhm.
Because it felt indulgent, and yet it doesn't feel like that to me now. And so I think really staying in touch with what you want, and I don't hear that as a selfish thing anymore. I hear it as a, pay attention to who you are in a really
Mhm.
unique way, like the quirky things that each of us loves and is good at and wants. That's not universal. That's reflective of, how we've each been wired. And I feel like I have a responsibility now to pay attention to that. And it doesn't feel selfish or self-indulgent or anything. It feels responsible in a sense. And so I don't know if some of that might help some of your listeners to say, what stage in that kind of journey are we at, to really get to know whatever version of ourselves is that we have right now. I was sending out some happy new year cards just this week, and I got little new stickers that say that version of me is no longer in print, and tuck
That's
them
cute.
in, and ask people, what version of you is in print right now? And I think
That.
that kind of question is super fun.
That is such a good question. It's so interesting that you went down the selfish path because I hadn't even asked that, but it was literally a question I wrote down. I
Mm,
wrote down, how can someone avoid falling into the trap of feeling selfish when prioritizing personal growth during transitions? Because it is a thing, like everything you just talked about, I can totally relate to because you're balancing like, okay, if I take this, that means that these things have to change, right? And is that selfish of me to make them be in a position of change as well because it requires an entire family transition rather than they get to keep doing XYZ and knowing the schedule and knowing when I'm going to be there, right? And if I don't take it, and I played with that same thing when it was even like you said, who's going to pick up the kids if they get sick at school? Like I had to have that whole conversation with my husband. Hey, this is something that I have had my heart set on since I was 18 years old and I first saw that helicopter land when I was going through EMT school. And I feel like I'm ready. And I also feel like I'm at the age where it's just go do it or don't. Make up your mind, Jill. So and I was like, "You know what? I need to just" and to be honest, I'm a person of faith, and I actually prayed for it. Been praying for it all year long and looking for, like, the signs and the feelings, and I'm like, "Okay, I'm gonna plan and I'm gonna prepare, and if it happens, then I will feel it's meant for me, and it'll be a much easier transition that way because 'cause I'll know that this is where I'm supposed to be, and
mhm.
if it doesn't happen, I planned, I prepared, and it didn't happen, and that's okay. It's not the right time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's kinda how I, like, went through my process of, is this meant for me right now in my life? And as I think we all ask that question, is it right now? Is it later? Should I have done it 5 years ago? And I don't wanna get to 5 years from now and regret going, "I should have done that 5 years ago."
Yeah.
Because,
Absolutely.
I mean, life is short too. And for me, I've had to make those kinds of decisions, I feel like, since I was really young, because I had my first son really young when I was going through college with a child.
Yep.
And I had to determine, like, does this choice actually make me better in the end? Does this make me a better mom in the end? Like, maybe in the transition, it's messy, right? The elastic is trying to stretch and sometimes it does snap. Let's just be honest.
Yeah.
And so, my word actually for this year is resilience. Like, how can I build my capacity so that I can have the energy to show up in everything that is important to me the way that I want to. And does it always look great? No, because that's life, right? But, when I build the capacity, when I build my resilience, and when I have that at the forefront of my mind, are you doing things for you, Jill, that are going to help build that resilience so that you can show up to these things? And I have to ask myself on a daily basis. I didn't get my workout in this morning, and that does help me build my resilience. And
Mhm.
so after this call, I have some studying to do, and I don't have one of those like treadmills with a table on it that I can set my laptop. But I just put it on a slower speed and I sit there with my laptop and walk because that's what I have right now. And I make do, but still, if I said I was going to show up for myself in this way, then that's what I'm going to do. And so I mean, it's been a huge transition. And so for everyone listening that is in that messy middle or in that transition phase, I think this conversation has been so helpful to also know we all go through that and it's all going to feel messy. And are you doing things that allow yourself to stretch and take on another form so that you can become that person that you want to be this year? Or are you stretching so far that you're going to snap? And I think that's such a good question when we're going for it. Would you say that, like, for those transition is a way to kind of help stretch our elastic in a way that helps it so we don't snap when we get there?
Partly, and I think that preparation can take lots of forms, right? It can take
Okay.
taking smaller risks before we take
Mhm.
the bigger one. For example, I think of it like a muscle, right? You're stretching your muscles a
Mhm.
little bit to get them ready for the big race, right?
Yeah.
Preparation, as you said, you're planning and preparing and watching. There's a perception. You're paying attention to calling, right? Of
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
timing and all of that.
Mhm.
I think that kind of thing can certainly help. And I think that when I think about timing, I think that's really important too because there may be there's real seasons of things, right? And in a
Yeah.
particular season in any family or system of relationships, we might have to kind of center the needs of one person more than another for a period of time. And so, for example, if you're studying for some big exams, you're buckling down to do that and you're not going
Mhm.
to be able to be as attentive or, attend every game or whatever it is during that time, but we help our kids or whomever see the long-term view of that. So I think if we can
Mhm.
be kind of looking at it with the long view in mind, that can also help because a particular season of preparation or study or I need everyone to step up for this period of time until
Mhm.
we find our new equilibrium can
Yeah.
help. And
Mhm.
I notice it with I have a daughter who had her first baby really young too, or fairly young. And I hear in the way that she parents her daughter, she's much better than I was at saying, what I can show up better for you if I get this time to myself, or if I go out with my girlfriends tonight, or if I make sure I get my workout in. I love spending time with you, but
Mhm.
I will be better at that if I can get to the gym right now. So I need you to let me do that. That kind of ongoing, not just trade off, but making sure that our kids know that our needs are as important as theirs, recognizing that we have more resources, we have more
Mhm.
control,
Mhm.
we have more maturity, all that stuff. But I really learned from my daughter in that in terms of her willingness to train her daughter to say, both people in this conversation have needs that are worthy of being met. And I
Mhm.
think because I had 4 kids in relatively short time and was pretty close to snowed under by that, my needs were just kind of survival for a while,
Yeah.
right? It's just
Yeah.
making sure people got fed and out the door.
Yep.
And I probably didn't learn differently than previous generations because I was working for pay and doing lots of other things during that time. But in order to keep all the balls in the
Mhm.
air, I probably didn't communicate to them that my needs were as important as their needs were at that time. And it's something that I've had to grow into as well.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to, and I'll say that I think we're more aware of it in this
I
generation.
think so.
However, I think we live in a world that is really rushed. then I think people have a hard time of figuring out, okay, this is how I feel now. What do I need?
Mhm.
Like okay, we feel this way, but then people don't investigate further to figure out, well, what do I need when I feel this way?
Yeah, and
Because,
in the sorry to interrupt, I was just gonna say in that
yeah.
elastic book, there's the second part after the metaphor is actually the word elastic is an acronym for
Ooh,
some skills that I think help us be more stretchy and adaptable.
oh,
And I
good.
I don't need to take time to go through the whole thing, but the first one, the letter E of elastic stands for energy. And I
Mm,
think energy for me has
mhm,
become a really important indicator of sort of well-being in myself and others. And so if I'm working with colleagues or I'm looking noticing in myself, if my energy is low or their energy is low, it's usually an indicator that some other things are needing some attention. And so I think paying attention to kind of the currencies that
yes,
matter to us, it's not just our bank account or how much time we have, but how energized are
yes.
we by certain things? Because there's times where we are crazy busy, but we're
Mhm,
great. Like we're good with it because we're
mhm.
loving, like it just lights us up and we're really energized by what we're doing. Whereas other times we could be less busy and even maybe less stressed, but it just isn't fitting us well. And therefore, the whole vibe is lower. So I think really paying attention to whatever signals are important to you to go, is this fitting all of us well right now? And also, what are we teaching our kids and the people who watch
Mhm.
us? It's not just our kids, but if we are role models for other people, there are times where I don't, if I'm suppressing my needs in favor of theirs, we might be concerned that would be selfish not to, but are we sort of building selfishness right into them, thinking that the whole universe revolves around them every minute of the day? And it doesn't. And them seeing us work really hard to get to a goal and express what we need and succeed in whatever we're looking at and pursue a dream that had been important to us. All of that is important too, not just
Mhm.
catering to their short-term need in that moment. And so sometimes on our bad moments, it can feel like just sort of self-justification all over the place. But I think that's why we need to know what anchors us.
Yeah.
And also another piece of that metaphor is if you've got an elastic that's super stretched,
Mhm.
if it gets like a little nick in it, some stress comes, whatever, and you get this little nick in it, it will snap, right?
Mhm.
But if that elastic has some buffer in it, if it's not quite as stretched and that same little nick comes, it doesn't snap. And so I think there's an element of having some buffer so that when some of those unexpected things come, or you do get that call from the school or whatever, you've got a little bit of breathing space that's going to let you flex with that. And I remember thinking about that when I was in the throes of really heavy duty parenting and driving kids and the whole thing, and just going, yeah, easy for somebody to say that to me. Have you seen my calendar? And yet now that I've got a lot more time on my hands, actually discretionary time, I think, wow, we really were. I spent a lot of my time with my elastic very stretched for a lot of years.
Mhm.
And,
Mhm.
I don't miss that part. Like, I
Yeah.
miss my kids being little for other reasons, but I don't miss that feeling of being constantly just aware of not having much margin. And if
Yeah.
something had happened, you figure it
Mhm.
out, but that there's not a lot of extra capacity there, and I'm thankful that one of the things I've grown into in this empty nest phase is enjoying having a bit of extra capacity that I just didn't have before.
Yeah, and I really thank you for being vulnerable on that one because I feel like so many people listening are like, "I feel so seen right now."
Mhm.
Because parenting is hard, can we just say that? It's hard, it is not an easy job, and I think it's the hardest one, actually. And you do feel like that sometimes, and so what is it that can anchor you and keep your elasticity there? That is so good. I cannot wait to grab your book because I wanna know all the rest of the elastic acronym now. E is energy, we just learned. How can people find the book and connect with you and learn more about your work?
Thanks for asking, Jill. I appreciate that. The
Yeah.
easiest way is just using my name, which is my website. So it's RebeccaSutherns.com. And Southerns, we always say it has no O. It's not South, but it's Sutherns. So people can just browse the whole site. But if they go to RebeccaSutherns.com/podcast, there's a place there where they can get a copy of the book. You can also get it on Amazon. But there's also a little quiz there that
Mm.
is it's called a True for You diagnostic. And it's just a little quiz to go, what do you need right now? Because sometimes in the middle of that middle, we
Mhm.
just know something's off, but we don't know what would help.
Yes.
And Maybe it's clarity would help. Maybe it's contribution or service or looking outside of yourself that would help. Maybe it's challenge. You talked about creating the next adventure, right? And so
Mhm.
it's just a little quiz that gives you a quick little report on 5 areas that I found in my practice. Usually we're craving some combination of those things. And therefore, when you put some language to that, you can know kind of what to go after. And it helps you move through that liminal or in between space with a bit more momentum and direction because you know what you need. So if you go to RebeccaSutherns.com/podcast, that quiz link is there, the book link is there, and all of my contact information and links to my other books and that kind of thing.
So cool. Well, thank you. And I'm super excited. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been incredible. I loved hearing all your insights and your tools.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate the opportunity. I've enjoyed the conversation, Jill.
Yeah, I know. I loved it. It's fun to just chat, right? And just, hey, this is life right now. Let's talk about it. So thank you for doing that with me.
My pleasure.
To our listeners, I hope this episode has inspired you to approach life's messy middle with more clarity, energy, and confidence. If you want to learn more about Rebecca's work or connect with her, be sure to check out her website and follow her on LinkedIn. I will put some links in the show notes. Thank you for tuning in to Life Without Secrets. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need a little encouragement right now. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and as always, let's keep living and growing without secrets. See you next time. Hey there, it's Julian from Life Without Secrets. Ever feel like you and your partner aren't quite on the same page? Well, you're not alone, and that's exactly why I created our latest issue of Truthful magazine. It's packed with insights and stories about bridging that gap and finding a deeper connection. We're diving into real conversations about needs, feelings, and how honest dialogue can rekindle that closeness that you've been missing. Why not explore this together? Go grab your free copy right now at lifewithoutsecrets.com and turn those pages into shared moments. Can't wait for you to dive in and share your thoughts with me.